The clock said 3:17 in the morning. The hospital was profoundly silent, broken only by the distant, steady beeping of a heart monitor and the muffled sound of the receptionist's footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The overhead, fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, creating an eerie and disconcerting ambiance. They were interspersed with shadows, cast by the movement of the lamps, which danced softly on the walls of the corridors. The environment was cold, but the receptionist didn't feel the cold. She was used to it. The hospital air always had a particular smell, a mix of cleanliness and something more pungent that she couldn't identify. Sitting behind the reception desk, she stared at her computer screen. He was typing slowly, his fingers moving mechanically, as his mind wandered. She gave a long yawn, putting her hand over her mouth, and looked at the clock again. The shift was slow, very slow. There were no patients to register, and appointments were scarce. Only the employees passed through it, with their own schedules and their own routines, each carrying the weight of the night shift. She picked up her cup of lukewarm coffee and took a sip, the bitter taste making her shiver. He had already gotten used to the loneliness at this time. She looked at the computer again. Something was wrong. The electronic record system had suddenly failed. The screens were frozen and no information could be accessed. She frowned, irritated, and after trying to restart the computer a few times without success, decided to resort to the physical file. With a sigh, he rose from his chair, grabbing the file cabinet key from the drawer next to his desk. The hallway was silent as she walked to the archive. The doors opened with a muffled sound, and the echo of their footsteps carried through the empty hallway. When he reached the filing cabinet, the key turned in the lock with a slight click, and the door slowly opened, revealing a shelf full of organized folders. She searched through the files until she found the folder she was looking for. It was for a night patient, a recent history. She pulled out the file folder and placed it on the table, removing the papers. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something unusual. The medical records were recorded in detail, with precise notes about the events that had occurred during the shift. The patient's name was written at the top of the first page, but when she turned to the next chart, something made her stomach turn. Her name was there, in clear capital letters, as if someone had written it on purpose, and she felt a shiver run up her spine. "What is this?" she muttered to herself. She turned another page. The notes detailed his work routine with frightening precision. "She's going to open the folder now," the next note said. She stopped, her hand trembling holding the sheet. His heart raced. The words were referring to her, describing her exact actions. She turned to the next page, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand. The notes were becoming more and more specific, more personal, as if they knew what she would do at each moment. She turned to the next page, her eyes fixed on the words. She will feel a shiver. She will feel the presence of something strange around her. She will try to ignore it, but she won't be able to. She swallowed hard, and her eyes began to move frantically across the pages. The words were aligning with how she felt, with what was happening in the moment. Each sentence seemed to anticipate his actions. With her heart racing, she turned to the last page. There, one last note appeared, with a simple but terrifying sentence. "She will not leave this room." Those words made her freeze. The room felt warmer now. She looked around, feeling the air thicken, as if something had changed in the environment. The silence around him felt thick and oppressive. She turned her head to look at the office door, which was closed, but she hadn't closed the door. The feeling that something was wrong set in uncontrollably. She tried to reason, try to understand what was happening, but the words on the page kept echoing in her mind. "She will not leave this room." The words seemed to be becoming more than just a prediction of actions. They now seemed like a condemnation. The receptionist stood up quickly, but felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She staggered to the door, tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. The door didn't move. She looked at the window, but the curtains were closed. Nothing seemed real. Everything was becoming distorted, and the feeling of being watched was increasing. She tried to think of a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I was there, alone in the room, with a folder that described it as if it were a simple experiment, and the words on the last page kept echoing, "She will not leave this room." Chuck's clock on the wall ticked silently. She felt the weight of those words, and at that moment, something inside her knew she was trapped, stuck there, in that cycle, without an explanation. The door would not open, and the words in the file would come true. She was in on the story now. The hospital was silent that morning, with only the distant and constant sound of the heart monitor and the occasional footsteps of the staff on duty breaking the tranquility of the night. The receptionist was alone at the counter, slowly working on the computer. It was 3:17 in the morning and everything seemed too calm. She looked at the clock, yawning, trying to stay awake. His shift was dragging on, and the routine seemed endless. Suddenly, the computer made a strange noise, interrupting the stillness of the room. She frowned, looking at the screen. The record system was having problems. Information that normally appeared within seconds was frozen, and the screen went black for a moment. She pressed a few keys, trying to get the system back to normal, but the error persisted. Instead of patient records, incomprehensible messages began to appear. A new patient's name was on the screen, but the data was unavailable. Something was wrong. She looked at the clock again, uneasily, and decided she needed to act quickly. The hospital still kept physical files in the basement, far away from digital systems. She hesitated for a moment, looking at the computer screen, and then got up from her chair, heading towards the file cabinet. I knew the only way to resolve the situation was to physically check the old records. The idea of going down to the basement in the middle of the night wasn't the most comfortable, but there was no alternative. The hospital was huge, and the shift was peaceful, but a kind of unrest seemed to grow by the second. With the file cabinet key in hand, she descended the creaking stairs to the basement. The air was colder here. A dull smell of old paper and wet wood filled the room. The lights in the basement occasionally flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The space was huge and full of shelves crammed with folders and documents. She didn't like it there, but she knew she had to find what she was looking for. With every step he took, the sound of his footsteps echoed, breaking the silence in a way that seemed almost exaggerated. She searched for the file, until she finally found the folder she was looking for. It was from a recently admitted patient, and the receptionist knew she had to check the records manually. When he picked up the folder and opened it, one detail immediately caught his attention. On the cover of the folder, there was a strange hand-drawn symbol. It was like a circular seal, which looked familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen it. She shook off the sensation and began flipping through the pages. The content was detailed as expected, but as she progressed, something was strange. The notes in the medical records seemed perfectly accurate, but with additional details that confused her. One note said, "She will open this folder now." She stopped and read it again, trying to understand. It was as if the notes were describing his actions in real time. The confusion increased as she continued to flip through the pages. A new note described exactly what she was feeling. She will be uncomfortable and try to look for a logical explanation, but will not find one. She swallowed hard, looking around, feeling the weight of something strange in the air. Each page felt more personal, more intimate, as if it were written by someone who knew exactly what she would do next. It was an unbearable feeling, as if she were being watched, as if everything she did was already being recorded by someone else. She turned to the last page of the folder, not knowing what to expect, but the final sentence made her blood run cold. "She will not leave this room." She stopped, feeling as if time had stopped. She couldn't breathe properly. She looked at the basement door, but it was locked. It couldn't be. She tried to turn the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. That moment seemed to be frozen, as if she were trapped in some kind of nightmare. The words on the page were clear and crisp, and she had known in the back of her mind that something was deeply wrong. She looked around. The silence in the basement was heavy. Nothing was right. Nothing was as it should be. She tried to get up, but the room seemed to close in around her. Fear took over his body. She was trapped, and the words in the file were becoming a reality she couldn't avoid. She looked at the last page once again, trying to deny what was happening, but everything seemed to indicate that her fate was already sealed. She will not leave this room. It was as if the words had power over her. Time continued to drag on. She looked at the file, but the feeling of being watched made her almost lose consciousness. The room seemed to close, and she didn't know how to get out. She didn't know how to escape that distorted reality. She could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. She was trapped. She walked down the basement steps carefully, the dim light of her cell phone flashlight barely illuminating the aged wooden steps. The air was heavy, stuffy, with the smell of old paper and disinfectant permeating the room. The place was dusty, and the feeling of confinement was palpable. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with folders and documents, some already yellowed with age. The silence was absolute, except for the muffled sound of his breathing, which seemed to echo in every corner of the basement. She walked to the nearest shelf, her steps heavy and quick. The hospital had always had an eerie feel at night, but this early morning was particularly uncomfortable. A failure in the record system had led her here, and she was determined to find the information she was looking for. But when looking through the newly admitted patient's files, she didn't find the folder she was expecting. Instead, something unexpected caught his eye. A separate folder, out of order, with a name written on the label. The name was hers. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes fixed on the typed label. How was this possible? She had never had physical records. She was just a receptionist. But there it was. Her full name was there, in clear letters, in an old-fashioned-looking file. The paper was yellowed with age, and the aging seal on the folder made her feel uncomfortable, as if she had found something she shouldn't have. She pulled the briefcase off the shelf and opened it with shaking hands. The pages were well preserved, but the content was what made her stop breathing for a moment. The cards were well organized, each describing a different event, but they all seemed to be recording his life with disconcerting accuracy. The first page was dated, but from a date she didn't recognize. The hospital didn't have old records like that. She continued flipping through the pages, and each one seemed to describe moments she had lived through, but in a strange and distant way, as if it were an account from a spectator rather than a participant. The notes were precise but cold. What made her most uneasy was when she read one of the notes. She's going down to the basement now. She swallowed hard. How was this possible? She hadn't spoken to anyone about what she was doing at that time. Each following page brought more details about your routine, your actions, and your choices. She will look at the door now. She will hesitate before opening the folder. One note read, "She will feel slight pressure on her chest as she approaches the shelf," said another. The feeling of déjà vu was unbearable, and fear began to spread through her like a silent disease. She turned to the last page, feeling a lump in her throat. There was no more room to deny what was happening. The last note seemed to predict what would happen next, but as he read it, dread took over his body. She won't leave this place. The words were printed clearly, as if they were being dictated directly to her. She stepped back, trying to understand what that meant. The air felt too heavy. What was happening? How did anyone know exactly what she would do? How could this be possible? The feeling of claustrophobia began to intensify. She looked around, trying to look for an explanation, an escape, but the cellar seemed to be closing in on her. She looked at the door, which was closed. He tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to spread, but she didn't know what to do. She tried to calm down, but the feeling that she was being watched intensified. The file was there, with details of his life recorded precisely. It was as if she had been turned into an experiment, an observation. The last sentence on the page left no room for doubt. She wouldn't get out of there. But what did that mean? Was she being controlled, manipulated? Or were you trapped in some kind of nightmare, where your choices were already determined? She looked at the file once more, and the words began to blur before her eyes. Anguish and fear began to dominate her mind, and the fear of not being able to escape paralyzed her. The door wouldn't open. The file had been written for her. She wouldn't leave that basement. And the last sentence wasn't just a prediction, it was a sentence. The receptionist opened the folder with shaking hands, feeling a growing pressure in her chest. The pages were yellowed but well cared for, with detailed and meticulous notes. The smell of aged paper mixed with the smell of dust and wet wood that filled the basement. She turned to the first page, and what she found left her breathless. Throughout, medical reports were perfectly organized, but the details recorded seemed absurd. The first entry was dated with machine precision, but the date was hours earlier than she had imagined. It entered the file at 3:24. She glanced quickly at the watch on her wrist. It was almost 3:30 in the morning. The words written on the page seemed to have been described while she was there, in that moment. She turned the page urgently. The next line recorded something even more impressive. Found the folder with your name on it. It was impossible. She hadn't said anything to anyone about it, much less did anyone know her full name. But there it was, an exact description of what he had just done, in the same minute. Panic began to set in as she turned another page. It rang in the bottom corner of the shelf. She blinked. That was exactly what she had just done. How was this possible? She didn't know what was happening. There was no logical explanation. Everything that was there was being recorded as she did it, as if someone had written her actions in real time without her knowing. Her breathing became heavier as she continued to flip through the pages. Each report was more detailed than the last, describing her movements with a precision that seemed impossible. He pulled out folder number 15, opened the cover with shaking hands. This was written before she even touched the folder. He looked at his watch. The time was 3:28. She looked at her watch again and, with a shiver down her spine, realized that the description was correct. It was as if she was trapped in a cycle, where every step she took was already registered in advance, was already part of a bigger plan that she didn't understand. It was a game, but she didn't know the rules. Fear began to take over her in a visceral way, a feeling of total impotence. She tried to think of a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. How could anyone know of your actions before they happen? With her mind in a whirl, she turned to the final page. What she found made her stop, not knowing what to do. The last note was there, written in black ink, without any changes. She will not leave this place. Those words stood out from all the others, and something inside her froze. The last sentence seemed to predict the future, but she didn't want to believe what she was reading. I couldn't. She tried to take a deep breath, but the words on the page began to blur, as if a fog was taking over her vision. She felt like the environment around her was becoming unreal, slowly distorting. The fear was now more than a sensation. It was in the air. The folder she was holding seemed to become increasingly heavy, and her hands began to shake. She closed the folder, but the strangeness didn't disappear. What else could be happening there? Was the archive watching her in some way? And how was it possible that this was being recorded in such detail before she even knew what was happening? Panic increased and she quickly got up, trying to leave the cellar, but the door was locked. The handle didn't move, as if someone had sealed the place. She began knocking on the door, calling for help, but her own voice seemed muffled, as if the sound was absorbed by the darkness itself. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. With her eyes fixed on the folder, she felt something else happening. Something was moving inside her mind, something she couldn't control. The feeling of being watched intensified, and she could no longer distinguish what was real and what was fiction. The words on the page were mixing with his own thoughts, as if his mind was being consumed by the narrative in that file. She turned her head to the bookshelf behind her, where boxes were stacked, but one of them was out of place. It was empty. She approached, but something made her hesitate. There was something inside her that was questioning itself. What was really happening there? Had she done something wrong? Or was she just being manipulated, as if she were part of a bigger story that she didn't understand? Before he could think any further, the words on the last page began to repeat in his mind. She will not leave this place. She was trapped. and no matter how hard she tried to get out, the basement walls seemed to close in. The story was happening in a way she couldn't escape, and with a crack in her back she felt a shiver. Something was waiting for her, and she would no longer be able to escape. She continued to flip through the pages, feeling as if she were distancing herself from reality. The words were increasingly specific, more invasive. The notes in the file described his breathing, his emotions, as if someone was inside his mind. He starts to break out in a cold sweat. She felt a bead of sweat running down her forehead. Look at the door. She followed the order of the words and, instinctively, her eyes turned to the basement door, which was ajar. Something didn't feel right. The door, which she was sure she had closed, now seemed darker, as if a shadow was swallowing her. The air was thicker. She turned another page, fear expanding in her chest. She thinks about leaving, but something stops her. She felt pressure in her stomach. What was happening? The words were describing her thoughts, her intentions, with a precision she could no longer ignore. His mind was in a panic, trying to process what that meant. How could anyone know what she thought? How could they predict her movements, her fears, before she even noticed them? She paused for a moment, the silence around her feeling heavier. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air was thick, difficult to absorb. Fear was growing in every cell of her body, and she could no longer think clearly. The words continued to invade her mind, and she could no longer separate what was real from what was written on those pages. The door seemed even darker now, as if something was moving behind it, waiting. What else could happen? What else could be described in the file? She didn't want to turn another page, but she felt like she had no choice. His eyes darted to the next entry. She tries to call someone on the radio, but all she hears is static. She swallowed hard and looked at the radio on the table. It was the only communication device in the basement. She approached him, but her hand hesitated in the air. What would happen if she tried to call someone? The file said she wouldn't be able to communicate, but still, she couldn't ignore the need to know if that would actually happen. She picked up the radio with a shaking hand and turned the knob, turning it on. The hiss was the first sound that filled the silence. She pressed the talk button but only heard static. The sound was deafening, as if the radio was consuming its own energy, sucking in the atmosphere around it. She released the button, and the device continued to emit a shrill sound, without any sign of communication. She felt a shiver run down her spine, panic rising within her. He looked again at the door, which now seemed more opaque, almost as if a fog was coming out from behind it. She backed away slowly, but something inside her told her not to turn her back to the door. Something was there, watching, something that shouldn't be there, something he already knew about all his actions. She looked at the file once more, as if to search for an answer to what was happening, but before she could turn the page, a voice whispered in her mind, "You can't leave." The feeling of being watched, of being manipulated, became unbearable. She wanted to scream, but the voice inside her head was stronger, clearer. The door was ajar. The darkness behind it seemed to swallow any light. She turned quickly, trying not to look at what was behind the door anymore, but a part of her mind forced her to look. She saw something moving slowly out of the shadow, like a shape reaching out from the darkness, a silhouette that seemed to grow as she looked. His vision was blurred, his heartbeat racing. Panic prevented her from acting. It was then that she heard the sound, a muffled noise coming from behind the door. Like something is trying to come out, like something is starting to manifest. She felt her body tensing, unable to move, and fear took over her mind. There was no way back. She was trapped, and everything that was happening had already been written. She was no longer a participant but an observer, and the words in the file were becoming a sentence she couldn't avoid. She could no longer distinguish what was real from what was described. The file, the radio, the door, everything was blending together, as if she was being absorbed by the handwritten narrative, something that was out of her control. She had nowhere else to go. There was no longer any escape. What was in the file was becoming her reality, and she no longer knew what the next step would be. She slowly bent down to pick up the pen that had fallen. The sound of metal rolling across the floor seemed amplified in the stillness of the basement. But as he crouched down, something caught his attention. A sheet slipped out of the folder and fell gently to the floor, stopping in front of him. She frowned, finding that movement strange. She hadn't touched the pages, but there it was, another lonely page. She took it with the same caution she had when handling the file, her fingers still shaking. The title of the page was emblazoned, in bold letters, "Last Record." The first thing that surprised her was the fact that the handwriting was different from that on the other pages. It was firmer, more recent, as if it came from someone writing urgently. Her eyes ran over the words quickly, and what she read made her freeze in place. She will not leave this room. The impact of those words was so strong that she almost felt her heart fail. That couldn't be true. She read it again, more carefully, as if trying to understand what was happening. But the sentence was there, etched into the page as if it were recorded just for her, and there was no doubt that it had been written by someone who knew exactly what would happen. I knew she was there. I knew what she would do next. The lyrics were more recent. They seemed to have been written minutes ago. She didn't know what to think. Panic rose inside her, constricting her throat and making it difficult to breathe. With sweaty hands, she looked around. The basement felt more stuffy now, the air becoming dense, as if it was being compressed, making everything even more suffocating. She stood up abruptly, but her legs felt weak, as if the feeling of being watched had actually materialized around her. As if that file was being written by something, or someone, other than her. Someone who knew each of your steps beforehand, and now that someone seemed to want her to stay there. Forever. She looked at the folder again, trying to muster the courage to continue. But the words from the last entry began to replay in his mind. She will not leave this room. How could anyone know this? How could anyone predict his movements so accurately? She was trapped in something she didn't understand, something that was beyond her ability to understand. The words on the page seemed like more than a simple prediction. They felt like an order. What else would be written in the file? What else would she have to face? The fear increased with every moment she spent in that basement. She approached the table, trying to keep control of her emotions, but everything seemed to be revolving around her. She no longer knew what was happening, but she knew that with every page she turned, she was further away from safety. She walked away from the table and headed towards the cellar door, but as soon as she got closer, she felt a pressure on her, as if something was blocking your exit. She pulled on the door handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked, as if someone had prevented her from leaving. A feeling of claustrophobia took over his body. The panic increased. She was trapped in a cycle she didn't understand, and it seemed like there was no way to escape. He looked at the folder again. Something inside told him that the answers were there, that she needed to keep going, that she needed to understand what was happening, or she would be consumed by fear. But the last sentence of the record seemed to be the sentence. She will not leave this room. How could something so simple seem so definitive? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain her balance, trying to focus. But when she opened her eyes, she realized she was no longer alone. Something or someone was watching her, and at that moment, the fear she felt seemed to have materialized, as if the environment around her was becoming tighter, darker. She could no longer trust what she saw. The feeling that she was no longer in control of the situation became even stronger, as if the archive had become her destiny. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that whatever it was, she was about to enter a cycle she couldn't break. And as the words echoed in her mind, she realized that she could no longer leave that place. The archive, the room, the archive, everything was intertwined, and the last sentence was repeated like an echo. She will not leave this room. Now more than ever she understood. She was trapped. Panic dominated her. She ran towards the door, trying to open it, but the metal seemed to close against her with a metallic click, as if she were being locked by something invisible. The basement lights began to blink intermittently, further increasing the feeling of claustrophobia and fear. She knocked hard on the door, screaming, calling for help, but the sound of her voice was lost in the void. Nothing seemed to respond. She quickly grabbed her cell phone, but when she looked at the screen, she realized there was no signal. Desperation set in, the words of the last entry ringing in his mind. She will not leave this room. She turned away from the door and looked around. The environment seemed to be changing. The folders on the shelves began to fall, one after another, as if they were being pulled by something invisible. The sound of briefcases hitting the floor reverberated in the empty space, a muffled sound that sounded like slow, deep breathing, as if the air itself was becoming denser, more oppressive. She swallowed hard, trying to process what was happening. I was alone in that basement, but everything seemed to be moving, like it was something I couldn't control. She looked up at the ceiling fan, hoping to see some sign that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But to his surprise, it began to slowly rotate, as if something had activated it. The strangest thing, however, was that there was no wind. The fan moved as if it had a force of its own, as if it was reacting to the environment, to the fear she was feeling. And the moment the fan began to spin, the breath in the air intensified, becoming denser, more palpable. She felt dizzy, her hands shaking as she tried to regain control. With each movement of the fan blade, she felt the pressure increase, as if the space around you was narrowing, compressing your mind, your body, and even your emotions. She took a few steps back, her eyes fixed on the fan that continued to spin. There was no longer a logical explanation. There was no more control. That's when she heard it. A strange hissing sound came from within the walls, as if something was trying to communicate with her. The air became heavy, and she could no longer breathe easily. The feeling of being watched, of being part of a narrative that I didn't understand, became unbearable. The door was closed, the room was locked, and increasingly she felt like she couldn't escape. The sound of falling folders echoed through the space, breathing stronger, more oppressive, closer. She took another step back, but the space seemed to have closed even more around her. The shelves were almost empty now, except for the folders lying on the floor. She looked at the folders one by one, and in each of them there seemed to be something more. A feeling that they were being watched, studied, and that she was at the center of it all. It was as if she was the main character in a story she had no control over, and her every action was being written by someone who knew what would happen before she even acted. She started to walk away, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty, but as she took another step, the lights went out. A deep darkness enveloped her, leaving her immersed in a disconcerting stillness. She didn't know what to do, where to go, how to escape. Everything seemed to have been predetermined, a sequence of events that she couldn't change. The fan on, the ceiling suddenly stopped spinning, but the sound of breathing still filled the air. She felt the pressure increase, as if time was stretching and compressing simultaneously. Every move she made, every thought that popped into her mind seemed to be anticipated, as if she were trapped in a cycle. And then she realized there was no longer any way out. There were no more open doors. She was trapped there, not by a physical blockage, but by something much deeper. The archive, the room, everything was becoming a prison without keys, and she was the main character, the only one who didn't know what would come next. She felt darkness invade her thoughts, as if fear was becoming a part of her, and finally she understood that she couldn't escape it. She would never leave that room. The last sound she heard was breathing, which now seemed to be the only real thing in that empty place. The sound of the radio sizzled again, breaking the heavy silence in the room. She froze, her heart racing, her eyes fixed on the screen. At the back of the room, the fan was still spinning non-stop, but now the atmosphere was heavier than ever. With a shaking hand, she reached for the desk drawer, trying to look away from the radio, but it was as if the invisible presence was always lurking, watching her every move. With a pull of wood, the drawer opened with a low creak. Inside, among papers and more papers, something stood out. A copy of the badge itself was there, lying on a pile of index cards. But something was wrong. The photo on the badge was not the same. She looked closer, trying to understand what was before her eyes, and soon terror took over her body. In the image, she looked paler, with her eyes sunken and empty, as if she were a version of herself, but older, more tired. With bated breath, she turned the badge over and read the inscription on the back. Receptionist, morning shift, permanent, replacement. A chill ran down his spine. The admission date was there, dated 10 years ago. The same date that appeared on the patient's file. The same date that seemed to have trapped her in a cycle from which she could no longer escape. Each word resonated like an omen, a sentence she should have understood long before, but was now becoming impossible to ignore. Permanent replacement. She read the words again, trying to process what it meant. What did this imply for her? For her life? How could this be possible? She was working there, at the hospital, but everything around her seemed like an illusion, a repetition of something she had already experienced. The radio hissed again, cutting off his thoughts. The hoarse voice, distorted by static, sounded low and almost unrecognizable, but the words didn't leave her alone. Welcome back. The cold enveloped her completely. She slowly turned to the radio, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The words echoed in her mind, repeating themselves over and over. Welcome back. But where did this voice come from? Who was talking to her? There were no more explanations, just the feeling that she had heard it before, had already lived it. But how? When? What she was beginning to realize with terrifying clarity was that she was no longer alone. Not physically, of course, but his mind, his being, seemed to be part of something much larger. A cycle that had no end. A cycle that she had already started and that, without wanting to, she had accepted. The voice on the radio wasn't just a greeting. It was a reminder, an invitation to return to the place she had always known she was destined to occupy. The hospital, the work, the early shift. It was all part of a repetitive pattern, a routine that was impossible to avoid, and that now, looking at her badge, she knew. She had already been the receptionist, she had already taken that shift, she had already lived through that endless night, and now she was stuck again, starting the cycle all over again. The hospital lights began to flicker softly, and she felt a growing pressure in her chest, as if the room itself was closing in around her. Her vision blurred, but she could no longer deny it. The words on the badge, the date, the phrase written on the back, they were all connected to a terrible truth that she could no longer ignore. She was stuck in that place, in that moment. She was just fulfilling a role she didn't know she had. And when the radio crackled once more, and the voice sounded, she could no longer resist. Welcome back. That was all she needed to hear to know that as long as she was there, she would never leave, and the cycle would continue without end, repeating itself infinitely. She was no longer a hospital receptionist. She was the forgotten piece of a never-ending game, and now, she was the permanent replacement. Days passed, and a new employee took over the early morning shift. She arrived at the hospital a little early, as she always did, to familiarize herself with the procedures and routines of that lonely time. The reception was silent except for the constant sound of monitors and fluorescent lights that illuminated the space with a cold, impersonal glow. She settled behind the counter and began her routine check, organized papers, checked patient files, and made necessary adjustments to the registration system. The hospital was in one of those rare quiet periods, where the dawn seemed longer than usual and the shadows stretched along the empty hallways. It was then that she noticed a forgotten folder at the bottom of the closet. It was a little dusty, as if no one had touched it in a long time. Curious, she took out the folder and, with the feeling that something wasn't right, decided to open it. Inside, he found a registration form, but it wasn't for a patient. The name on the file made her stop for a moment, a strange feeling taking over her. The name on the file was that of a previous receptionist, a woman who had worked that shift. She frowned, trying to remember the name, but she couldn't. The date of birth was there, but the date of death field was blank with just a thin, incomplete line. Something in the file seemed disconnected, as if the information was being withheld, prevented from being revealed. As I looked at the chart, something flashed by in the hallway. A shadow, difficult to identify, but clear enough to make your stomach Turn. She stood up instinctively, looking toward the hallway but saw no one. The silence returned, thick and uncomfortable. She glanced at the clock at the front desk, 3:17. The clock was stopped, motionless. The hour seemed frozen, in time, and a chill ran down his spine. She felt like something was wrong, something she couldn't fully understand. The chip was in his hand, but the feeling that it shouldn't be there, that something had changed, was palpable. She looked at the chart again, but could no longer focus on the words. What had happened to the previous receptionist? She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't understand it. What did that blank field mean? The frozen time, the shadow that passed so quickly across the corridor. She wondered if the woman had left the hospital at some point, or if she was still there somehow. The new employee closed the folder carefully and placed it back at the back of the cabinet. But what she felt now was different. The weight of that record seemed to have stayed with her, as if it had opened a door to something she could no longer ignore. The weather seemed to have changed around him, and the silence of the early morning became increasingly dense, more threatening. As she returned to her post, the reception clock was still stopped, and the shadow seemed to still be floating in the air, invisible but definitely there. With every step, she felt like she was being watched, like she was part of a cycle that she couldn't escape. And then, suddenly, the previous receptionist's file, the feeling that something was about to happen, and the stopped clock. It all started to make sense. The new employee didn't know what to expect, but she knew that somehow she was being pulled into something that had happened before. The clock stopped at 3:17, and she had the feeling that time was now completely out of her control. She was no longer just there to work. She had become part of the system, like every other receptionist before her. And deep down she knew, that hospital, that shift, that reception. She was stuck in a cycle that could never be stopped. Time seemed to be the only thing that repeated itself. And now she was just another piece in the puzzle, waiting for the moment when the clock would strike 3:17 again. The cycle would never end. She was no longer a hospital receptionist. She was the forgotten piece of a never-ending game, and now she was the permanent replacement. The convenience store was nearly deserted except for the dull sound of the running refrigerator and the soft hum of music on the radio. The attendant, a young woman with a tired face, did her work while the night dragged on slowly and silently. The clock in the corner of the wall said 2:10 in the morning. The shelves, already sorted once during the shift, required more attention. Packets of cookies and chocolate bars moved to line up with cases of soda. The only constant sound was that of fluorescent lamps, with their yellowish colors that colored the environment with a cold and artificial light. Outside, the scene was desolate. The empty road stretched for miles, interrupted only by a tree or other distant landmark. Insects buzzed in the shadows of the night, and occasionally the rumble of a distant car broke the silence, but nothing else seemed to disturb the peace of the night. She glanced at the large glass that covered the front of the store, reflecting the interior like a mirror. She could see her own image, the uniform, the tied-up hair, the tired eyes, and behind her, the shelves of convenience. It was then that she noticed something unusual. For the first time that night, his eyes fell on a figure standing outside, standing motionless on the sidewalk. He stood in the distance, in a dark suit, a rigid silhouette, as if he had been waiting. At first he thought it was just a passerby, maybe a lost driver or someone trying to get some fresh air, but the man didn't move. He just watched her, fixed. She swallowed hard and, uncomfortably, looked away. The rest of the night passed without further incident. The cars continued to pass, and the figure stood there, like a motionless shadow. But when she looked again, the man was gone. There was no one else outside the store, as if they had never been there. The following nights he returned, always in the same position, always fixed, in a dark suit, as if he were just there to observe her. The attendant tried to ignore it at first, rationalizing it as just another strange being passing by on the road. But as the nights dragged on, his presence became more and more unsettling. Why didn't he ever come in? Why didn't it move? The silence that surrounded him only made the scene more disturbing. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. Her curiosity and growing discomfort led her to pick up the phone and call the police. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Two men, both looking tired and a little impatient with what seemed like just another false complaint. "He's just there, standing there, watching me the whole time," she said, pointing to the spot, where he always stood. The police officers, suspicious, looked at the front of the store, but to her surprise, the man was no longer there. The sidewalk was empty, and the silence that had once terrified her now seemed even more ominous. "We don't see anyone, ma'am," one of the police officers said, with a doubtful expression, looking at the deserted road. "There's no one else in the area." "But he was here, I swear," she insisted. "He always appears. He doesn't move. He just stares at me." They looked at the street again, but as if the man had disappeared into thin air, leaving no trace. The officers took one last look at her and with a condescending smile walked away, saying that if the problem persisted, they would return. But that night, to her surprise, he was back. The figure of the man in the suit was there, once again, standing on the sidewalk looking at her. But this time, what stopped her in her tracks was what she saw in the reflection in the glass. He was no longer outside. Inside the store, in front of the window, he was there, still as always, looking at her. The man's reflection was standing once again, his eyes fixed on her. But something was different this time. The man was no longer just outside the store. He was inside her, as if he had walked through glass. She backed away slowly, her heart beating faster. The man, as if he knew what she was thinking, smiled. A cold, empty, emotionless smile. Terror gripped her, and she turned to run, but when she looked back at the glass, the man's reflection was there. But now he no longer smiled. He watched her, fixedly through the window, with a look that made her blood run cold. She didn't know what was going on, or what he wanted, but now she knew he wasn't just watching anymore. He was inside the store, inside his mind, and closer than he could have ever imagined. It was a quiet night at the convenience store. The early morning shift was dragging on slowly, and the attendant was busy with routine tasks. She organized stocks, repositioned products, and checked what needed to be replenished. The soft sound of music on the radio and the hum of fluorescent lights were the only things that broke the silence of the empty store. As time passed, she felt more and more tired. The clock on the wall said almost 3 in the morning, and the store was completely deserted except for her. The wind outside was blowing slightly, but the dawn seemed calm, almost oppressive. There were no cars passing by, no people to attend to, just silence. It was then that suddenly a shiver ran down his spine. For no apparent reason, she looked at the large glass window that occupied the front of the store. Something caught his attention immediately. Outside, standing on the sidewalk, was a man. He was standing still, looking straight at her. The light from the store partially illuminated his face, but he was shrouded in shadow. She couldn't make out his features very well, but she could see that he was wearing a dark suit and tie, something that seemed out of place in this place. He didn't move. "Don't blink." His eyes were fixed on her without looking away. The scene was strange and uncomfortable. She felt a knot in her stomach, but quickly tried to shake the feeling of dread away. Maybe he was just a passerby, someone who stopped to rest, or perhaps someone who had noticed the store open and was waiting to enter. But even so, something about the situation bothered her deeply. She forced a sigh and looked away, trying to regain her focus on the store's tasks. I pretended like nothing was happening, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if that man's presence was permeating the environment, as if he were inside the store watching every move she made. She looked out the window again. The man was still there, in the same position, motionless. Something inside her made her stop and question, who was he? Why was he there, standing there, staring at her? There was no logical explanation, but the discomfort in her chest only increased. Trying to remain calm, she glanced at the store clock. Time was dragging on, but he was there, steady as a statue, without moving. His eyes never left hers. She thought about going to the door and asking if he needed anything, but something stopped her from moving. She was paralyzed, not by the absence of courage, but by a much deeper sensation. Something felt wrong, as if the man wasn't just someone on the sidewalk, but part of something darker, something that shouldn't be there. She looked out the window again, trying to see if he had walked away or if someone had called him. But the man was still there. Motionless, she felt a weight in the air, a presence that made her feel small and vulnerable. Something inside her asked her to go to the door, but fear clung to her bones. She didn't know why, but a growing feeling that something terrible was about to happen began to dominate her thoughts. He then decided to do something simple, look away and pretend nothing was happening. But, as if responding to her attempt to deny the situation, the man leaned in slightly, his head moving towards her, as if he knew what she was thinking. Whatever it was aware of her every move. The clock continued to tick slowly, but she was no longer focused on it. What really mattered was that man. He was still there, standing still, watching. The store's atmosphere seemed to change, becoming denser, more oppressive. It was as if the room was trying to swallow the silence she was trying to create, as if space itself was closing in around her. She felt like she could no longer ignore the man. He was there, but at the same time she couldn't understand what he represented. Why was it there? What did he want? She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry. There was no sound, no movement. It was then that something very strange happened. At the exact moment she tried to look away again, he moved his head slightly to the side, his eyes remaining fixed on her, with an intensity impossible to describe. What she felt was a sensation of being swallowed by his gaze, as if reality itself was being distorted, and she was the next to disappear. She knew something was about to happen, something she could no longer control. The man was closer than he had ever imagined. The attendant was sitting behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she held the phone. Her heart was beating fast, a feeling of growing panic taking over her. The man in the window, that strange being who had watched her in absolute silence, had now disappeared. The momentary relief at not seeing him there anymore was soon replaced by an even greater uneasiness. What did he want? Why was he there, standing there, staring at her? She quickly picked up the phone and, with her voice still tense, called the police. The line was answered quickly and she explained without even breathing what had happened. A strange man, standing in front of the store doing nothing but watching her. It was late, very late, and she was alone, the only person awake in the store. She didn't know what to expect, but the feeling that she was being watched never left her mind. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived. They had a tired expression, probably having answered calls in other areas of the city, but they quickly straightened up when they noticed the genuine concern on the operator's face. She guided them to the window, pointing to the exact place where the man was. "He was right there," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "He didn't move. He didn't come in. He just stared at me." The police looked at the location she indicated, but the sidewalk was empty. The place that was once occupied by man was now deserted, no sign of anyone. "Miss, we don't see anyone." "It must have been a mistake," one of the officers said as he began to look around the store. The other walked outside, watching the street for any clues. I saw him. He was here. He looked at me all the time." "No, it wasn't a mistake," she insisted, her voice lower now, but still filled with uncertainty. Officers examined the surroundings, circling the store and nearby streets, but as before found nothing to suggest the man's presence. They returned, looking calmer and perhaps even a little skeptical. One of them looked at the attendant with a forced smile and said, "It must have been some drunk, miss. He might have walked away quickly. You know how these things are. There's no need to worry." But the attendant knew that wasn't the case. He wasn't a drunk. There was something different about those times, something calculated in that man's gaze. He wasn't there by chance. He had watched her, in a way that was not just curious, but with purpose. And what she felt, viscerally, was that he knew something she didn't. Something that was beyond the mere presence of a stranger on an ordinary night. She didn't have the strength to protest anymore. The police officers left towards the car, still muttering among themselves, leaving her there, with restlessness and fear spreading throughout her body. The feeling of being watched did not disappear. She looked at the window once more, waiting, fearing that he would appear again. But no, the sidewalk was empty, the glass reflecting only his face, pale and tired. The early morning continued, and she sat behind the counter again, with her eyes fixed on the window. I tried at all costs to rationalize what had happened, but something inside her wouldn't let her rest. She knew that the man was not there by chance. I knew that what happened that night was not simple or banal. And the only thing I could think about was, what did he want from her? And although silence regained its grip, she knew that as she looked out that window, she would have no rest until the man returned. She was being watched, and no matter how much time passed, she knew that one day he would return. And the next time, maybe he wouldn't be outside anymore. The following night, the routine seemed to be returning to normal. The clock said the same. Time, and the convenience store was silent again, except for the familiar sounds of shelves being rearranged and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. The attendant, still a little anxious from the previous night's experience, tried to concentrate on her work. But as if waiting for something, his eyes strayed to the window again. It was at that moment that she saw him. The man was back. He was in the same place, standing in a dark suit and tie, standing on the sidewalk like last time. But something was different. He was closer now, much closer, enough so that she could see the details of his face more clearly, but still, something was dark and incomplete. His eyes, which had previously seemed almost empty, were now darker, as if they were sucking in the light around him. It was as if his presence was draining all the energy from the store. She felt her stomach tighten. The fear she had tried to bury the night before was back, more intense. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the figure was there, standing still, watching. The air inside the store felt thicker, and tension took over his body. Trying to control her anxiety, she took out her cell phone, hoping that at least one photo could confirm what was happening. She brought the device closer to the window and, with a shaking hand, took a photo of the man. But when he looked at his cell phone screen, he didn't see the image he expected. Instead of the man standing on the sidewalk, the screen showed only blurred reflections of the store, distorted shadows, no shape and no figure visible outside. Confused, she looked back at the window, at the place where the man was, and he wasn't there anymore. The tension in his body eased, but not because the man was gone. No. The discomfort came from something else. The feeling that he had never really been there, as if his fixed, heavy gaze had not existed. She looked, out the window now completely empty, and for a second she thought she had made a mistake, that it was a trick of the mind. But she knew deep down that it hadn't been an illusion. There was something real, a tangible presence that still hung in the air. She backed up to the counter, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The cell phone was still in her hand, and she looked at the screen once again, hoping the image had just been a glitch, but nothing on the screen fit. She tried to slide her finger to unlock the phone, but the screen was flickering, as if a shadow had covered the camera lens. The pressure in his head increased. She tried to convince herself that it was all just a series of coincidences, but the silence of everything around him was too oppressive. It was as if the world had stopped, waiting, watching. The feeling of being watched intensified when she looked out the window again. She no longer saw the store's reflection. The glass reflected only a shadowy emptiness, as if everything she knew was a lost echo. She approached the window and the reflection returned, but now distorted, out of shape. And then, the worst happened. She heard a sound. It was not a physical sound, but a presence. Something touching her. Something that shouldn't be there. When she looked at her reflection, the man was back. Not on the street, not from outside the store, but reflected in the glass. He was inside. The store, behind her, standing silently, looking at her. His eyes now seemed deeper, more threatening. She felt her fear growing, as if she were swallowed by her own image. She could no longer distinguish where her reflection ended and the man began. She took a step back, feeling her heart beat wildly. But when she turned to look, he was no longer there, and the store was empty again. The tension inside the convenience store was increasing by the second. The attendant tried to concentrate on her work, but the environment around her seemed too immaculate, with an oppressive stillness taking over the space. His eyes moved restlessly between the shelves and the counter, always returning to the window where each time he looked he didn't find the man in the suit. However, the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. On the contrary, it only grew. Suddenly she heard a sound, light footsteps in the back hallway of the store. A click, as if something had been moved, followed by a slight creak. The attendant froze, her muscles tense, waiting to hear more. The sound stopped for a moment, but then it came again, clearer, more distinct. Steps. She hurriedly got up, leaving her empty coffee cup on the counter. His heart raced in his chest. With every step she took toward the back of the store, the sound seemed to move away, heading toward the back door. She looked at the empty hallways, feeling a strange sensation of being watched, even without anyone there. Silence soon settled in again, but the air felt thick, heavy with a strange energy, something she couldn't explain. She looked around, trying to convince herself that there was nothing to fear. Taking a deep breath, she walked back to the front of the store, passing through the shelves of snacks and drinks until she reached the register. When he looked at the window, the dim light from the store reflected on his face, but something wasn't right. She froze. In the glass, the reflection was not like before. She was there, standing behind the counter. But the reflected image showed more than just her. Behind her reflected body was the man in the suit, standing still, watching her. He was there, inside the store, behind her. His face was clearer than ever, his empty eyes fixed on her, as if he were waiting. A shiver ran down his spine. She turned quickly. Her steps hurried to the store door, but when she looked at the reality around her, there was no one there. The man was missing. The store was empty, as it always had been. But the reflection, that frightening reflection, continued to record his image. Her heart beat wildly. It wasn't possible. She had just seen him in the window, but there was no sign of his presence now. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. A chill took over his arms and legs. She looked at her reflection again, feeling a growing pressure in her chest. The man in the suit was there, but his image was distorted, more vague, as if he were being dissolved by the ambient light itself. She didn't know what to do. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to suddenly increase. She took another step back and once again looked into the glass window, but the man was gone. Once again, the glass reflected only emptiness. For a moment, everything seemed to have returned to normal. But then, something made her look at the window once again, her eyes wide and fear spreading through every fiber of her being. A thin line of sweat ran down his forehead. In the reflection, she saw a figure form behind her, but it wasn't the image of the man in the suit. It was her own image, a version of herself, standing still, looking directly at her. His eyes were fixed on her, but his face was blank, an impassive expression, as if the mirror image was waiting. The attendant, now paralyzed, watched that reflected figure, trying to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light, a flaw in the glass. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong grew even more. She was sure the man in the suit was there, but why was he hiding now that he was already inside the store? The air was thick, impenetrable, as if the store was turning into a prison. She needed to get out of there, but the doors wouldn't open. She was being watched. But by whom? Why was he there? She tried to convince herself that she was not in danger, but the questions consumed her, and with them, the fear that perhaps there was no way to leave that store. The attendant felt a growing weight in her chest as she tried to ignore the reflection of the man who, even outside the store, still seemed to be there. The glass in the window reflected his image, but when you looked at it, nothing moved. The figure of the man in the suit was immersed in reflection, motionless, with his dark, empty eyes, watching her in a disturbing manner. He was no longer on the street. But still, she felt his presence, an echo that never stopped. She tried not to look. He tried to concentrate on his work, to move. But every time he passed by the window, his eyes inevitably turned to him. The image didn't disappear. It was there, in the store's glass, watching. It was as if he were trapped there, forcing her to recognize him, to feel his constant presence. The reflection seemed immune to his attempt to ignore it. With her heart racing and her body tense, she took an old cloth and covered the window. The cloth hid the image, but even so, she couldn't relax. Instead of relief, a shiver ran up her spine, as if the man was still there, lurking, ready to appear again. With her nerves on edge, she walked away, trying to do what she knew was the most rational thing to do. If he couldn't see, he couldn't fear. She turned off the store lights, hoping the darkness would calm her. But nothing made the feeling of being watched lessen. The atmosphere was heavier. The store that previously seemed ordinary now seemed to breathe, as if the very structure of the place had come to life. The walls seemed to pulse, the air was thicker, and the sound of the room seemed to have changed. The silence had become oppressive, and the man's presence seemed to increase, not decrease. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus on her breathing, trying to push away the fear. But even with her eyes closed, she felt his presence there, watching, waiting. His stomach turned, and a feeling of despair began to settle in his chest. How could he still be there if there was no sign of his physical presence? How was he still watching her? The clock on the store wall, which was previously keeping time accurately, suddenly stopped. The minute hand stopped, settling at 2 hours and 10 minutes. It wasn't possible. She looked at the clock, trying to turn it with her hand, but nothing worked. Time had frozen. She was lost in a space where time didn't pass, where what was happening around her no longer had any logic. She walked back to the display case where the reflection of her hands now trembled, her palms sweaty. She had hoped not to see him, but as she looked at the covered glass, she saw that the cloth had moved slightly, and a part of the man's reflection was visible again, although his image was distorted, as if he were being pressed against the glass. He seemed closer now, like he was inside the store with her. She backed away, panic rising. He was there, still watching, as if he had never left. What was happening? How was this possible? She was beginning to lose control over what was real and what wasn't. The sound of her own footsteps seemed more distant now, as if she were trapped in a parallel reality. She was alone, but the man was with her. He saw her, he watched her, and she couldn't escape. The air in the store seemed thicker, and the fear more intense. She could no longer distinguish where her reality ended and where madness began. Space was distorting. She was alone in the store, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was there, in every corner, in every shadow. What did he want? Why was he watching her in such a calculated way? She didn't know how to act anymore. Every movement felt futile, as if the store was swallowing her, along with her own sanity. During a sudden power outage, the store was plunged into thick darkness, but soon the emergency lights came on, illuminating the shelves and floor in a dim, unsteady manner. The generator kicked in, but the light flickered, leaving the room in a state of constant oscillation. The atmosphere became even more tense, as if the store itself was breathing hard. She walked from side to side, trying to control the growing feeling of dread when a figure appeared reflected in the glass of the freezer. Slowly, the man in the suit approached, his steps calculated, slow and steady. The silhouette was unmistakable, and the gaze, fixed towards it, seemed to carry an intention. Each movement, meticulously synchronized with the light's own tremors. She stopped, her heart racing, trying to process what she saw. She knew he wasn't physically there. She knew he could only be in the reflection, but as he got closer, she felt a sense of foreboding, as if something was about to happen. The tension in the store became palpable. The sound of her breathing seemed deafening in the void, but the reflection didn't stop. He continued to approach with precision, always one step behind his perception. She quickly turned to face the store, trying to shake off the feeling that he was approaching. When he turned around, however, there was nothing left in front of him. The space was empty. Panic began to take over her, but she tried to remain calm. Then, as she looked at the storage door, she noticed it was ajar. How had she not heard the door open? She always remembered to lock that entrance. The feeling of being watched made her move closer, fear tightening her chest. She approached the stock door, but before entering she looked again at the reflection of the store in the freezer glass. The man was still there. He was standing in a corner, but never fixedly. He moved like a shadow, always positioning himself where she wasn't looking, as if he were lurking, never ceasing to watch her. She took a step into the storage room, and with that, the feeling of being followed increased. The reflection in the glass seemed to take on a life of its own. His image was no longer restricted to the glass but spread throughout the store, as if it were infiltrating the walls, the space. She ran to the store door, but what she saw in her reflection made her stop in her tracks. There, in the reflection of the glass door, she saw him again. The man was in front of her, standing motionless, staring with empty eyes. And this time, there was no longer any doubt. He was inside the store. The figure she saw was not just reflected, he was actually there. But he didn't move, he didn't do anything. He was just there, like he was a part of the store, a shadow that never disappeared. Panic took over her, and as she turned to leave, the sound of the door closing echoed through the store. Reality distorted around him. The dim lights flickered, as if they were struggling to stay on. She tried to run towards the exit, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every step she took seemed to echo distortedly in her own ear. She felt like she was no longer alone. He looked at the glass again. And there he was, now closer. His image was not just a reflection, but a fixed point in the store. It was as if he was waiting for her to make the wrong move, as if he knew exactly what she would do. She felt a wave of despair, but she couldn't look away. The man's reflection began to move in a way she could no longer predict. The store seemed to have transformed into a place where the rules of space and time fell apart. The sound of her breathing mixed with the sound of the lamps buzzing in the darkness, and the man, immutable, did not let her escape. She was trapped, and the worst part was that, when he looked at his reflection again, he smiled. She ran through the store shelves, trying to find a way out. The doors, which had previously seemed to be their only escape, were now locked. She pulled the handles, hard, but nothing happened. The key turned uselessly, and a feeling of claustrophobia began to take over his body. The sound of buzzing lamps intensified her anguish, and she felt like time was stretching out unbearably. She turned to the phone, and with shaking hands tried to call the police again. The cell phone screen lit up, but the call did not go through. The signal seemed to disappear with each attempt, and the silence dragged on, broken only by the distant sound of his own hurried breathing. Anguish enveloped her, and a sense of inevitability made her tremble. Each second felt denser than the last. Then, suddenly, the radio, which was turned off, began to emit a sound. She looked at the antenna with an expression of horror. The voice that came from the radio was not that of any stranger but his own. The words dragged on as if they were spoken by someone who had been waiting a long time to speak. "He's here. He never left." Those words, spoken in his own voice, burned his mind with a painful intensity. She looked at the radio, feeling as if she were being watched from within the radio itself. Panic began to take over her completely. How was this possible? Who was trying to communicate with her like that? How could she hear her own voice, as if it were someone outside? She looked around desperately, trying to find something, anything that made sense. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, and her mind was so confused that reality itself seemed to distort. She felt like she was losing control. She could no longer distinguish what was real and what was just a manifestation of this invisible presence that haunted her. She headed for the window, the only thing that seemed to give her any direction. Her hand touched the cold glass and, her eyes watering with fear, she pressed her forehead against the transparent surface. She tried to take a deep breath, try to find some calm, but the reflection of her own image, reflected there in the window, didn't leave her. But it wasn't just her. There was something more. In the eyes of his reflection there was something more. Something that shouldn't be there. Her reflection was intact, but now, in her eyes, behind her own eyes, was him. The man, the one who watched her, stood behind his own eyes. He was no longer outside. He was there, inside her, reflected, taking over her own vision. She recoiled with a silent scream, but his image did not move away. It was there, in an even more oppressive way, as if it had invaded not just physical space but his own perception. Her reflection remained motionless, but now he no longer saw her with a blank stare. He smiled, a distorted smile, as if she was the last thing he ever wanted to see. And now he had achieved it. The feeling of being swallowed by this presence took over her body. She knew there was no longer any way to escape. The window glass, the reflection in the glass, everything blended into a blurred vision of terror. She felt reality fragmenting, her very identity being eroded. The truth imposed itself cold and cruel. There was no longer a safe place. She was being consumed by the reflection. The man never left. He was inside her the whole time. And now he was taking control in a way she couldn't understand. The last thing she saw before losing herself completely was his smile widening, reflected in her own eyes. Darkness swallowed her, and in the absolute silence of the store, there was nothing left, just the immensity of the reflection and of the man who never stopped being there. Days later, a new employee was hired for the early morning shift. The hospital continued its usual rhythm, with the stillness of night filling the lonely corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the distant sound of the fan still resonated through the empty rooms. The young woman was anxious but excited. The shift could be lonely, but she needed the job, and the routine seemed simple. She checked the records, rearranged some shelves, and settled in behind the counter. The stillness of the night seemed to envelop her with a familiar air. Everything seemed normal, but as the night deepened, an uncomfortable feeling began to take over his body. It was like something was wrong, something she couldn't put her finger on. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't. Whatever it was starting to manifest. With a sudden shiver, she looked up from her computer screen and looked at the display case in front of her. The convenience store was dark and quiet, but outside, in the distance, a figure stood out. A woman in uniform stood motionless. His gaze was fixed on her. The employee felt her blood run cold in her veins. He couldn't say exactly how, but there was something deeply wrong in that woman's expression. The reflection in the window glass did not correspond to his movements. The woman outside was still standing motionless, but the attendant's reflection showed that she was moving. His own footsteps echoed in the window, while the figure outside remained fixed, staring, as if waiting for something. But her reflection didn't match what she was doing. Something was out of place. The attendant felt the weight of the woman's penetrating gaze. It was a distant, strange look, and she felt as if she were being watched in a way she couldn't understand. The silence around her intensified, and she could no longer ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. He looked at the glass once more. The figure was standing there, in a place where it shouldn't have been. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing, but the reflection seemed more real than her own reflection. The woman's gaze in the window seemed more intense. It was as if she was looking at something the attendant couldn't see. The feeling of discomfort grew with every second. The woman in uniform outside still didn't move. It was such an unreal scenario that the attendant was paralyzed, feeling time stretching out and becoming heavier. That was when she felt a chill run up her spine and looked at the glass again. The woman outside now seemed to be closer. Her eyes were more penetrating, and she didn't blink, just stared. The reflection was no longer just reflecting his own movements. Now, the attendant saw something different. She could see her own eyes reflected, but there was something more, something strange and dark. It was as if the reflection was no longer hers, but that of another person, another entity, another presence. She tried to move, but felt paralyzed. Every step I took in the store seemed to be reflected with a delay. The feeling of being watched increased, and her body seemed disconnected from reality. She looked back at the window, and now, instead of just a reflection, there was another figure outside. The woman was still there, but in the background, the attendant saw the image of a figure with its eyes fixed on her, as if looking from within. The young woman felt the pressure in her chest increase, a growing sense of panic enveloping her, and without thinking, she took a step back. When she looked at the window, she saw the figure watching her with a penetrating gaze. It wasn't the woman in uniform. There was no one else outside. It was herself, but not with her eyes, not with the familiar expression. It was someone who was inside her, looking out, with an empty smile on her face, a presence that seemed torn from her very essence. The reflection distorted, and she no longer knew who or what she was reflecting on. She knew what was happening, but she couldn't understand it. The attendant walked away from the window, dizzy, out of breath. The air was thick, and the sound of the music on the radio slowly faded. In the distance, the woman in uniform no longer moved. She just looked, but the attendant felt that she was observing something else, something she couldn't see, something that was now inside her. The building's surveillance room was cold, lit only by the dim light of emergency lamps. The monotonous sound of the old fan filled the empty space, while the clock on the wall showed 1 hour and 4 minutes in the morning. Samuel, the night security guard, entered the room with heavy steps, the tiredness of the day still weighing on his shoulders. He turned off the alarm and began turning on the lights, illuminating the monitor screen spread out on the wall in front of him. The hot coffee in his hand was the only thing keeping him from feeling completely exhausted. The cameras showed empty images of dark corridors and abandoned warehouses, with shadows in corners where the light barely reached. Nothing but silence. On the wall, a fly banged against the lamp with almost unbearable insistence, the sharp sound penetrating his mind like a constant irritation. Samuel placed the glass on the table and adjusted his chair, throwing his feet up on the table surface as he watched the monitors. It was another routine night, but something in the air felt slightly different. He couldn't say exactly what was wrong, but the heavy silence and darkness of the building's disused corridors made him feel an uncomfortable tension. He tried to ignore it, closing his eyes for a moment, but something in the room made him feel like he was being watched. It was then that the camera system notification appeared on the screen. Motion detected. Samuel sat up straighter and looked at the central monitor. It was in the decommissioned wing of the building, a part of the building that had been isolated since several floors were closed years ago. The camera system was set up to detect any movement in that area, as the location was never accessed. He observed the shadowy hallway where the image was blurry, but he could make out the shape of a figure that was moving slowly, as if it was walking from one side to the other, the figure moving with an unsettling calm. Samuel's body tensed. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the table. Who the hell would be there, he thought, feeling a feeling of uneasiness rise in his chest. The wing was empty. No one had accessed that part of the building in years. He got up from his chair quickly, leaving his coffee behind, and ran to the door. With a hurried step, he walked to the corridor that led to the entrance to that deactivated wing. Everything was silent, just the echo of his footsteps on the cold stone. He unlocked the door with a sigh, still doubting what he had seen. When he arrived at the location indicated by the camera, the wing was empty. The hallway, with its dirty walls and ruined doors, showed no signs of life. Was it just a glitch in the system? He thought, a feeling of unease still following him as he walked back to the surveillance room. Upon returning, he looked at the monitors, where the image of the deactivated ward had disappeared. But now the camera in his own room was on, showing a single angle, that of the table where he had just left. And then, his heart skipped a beat. On the screen, the figure was there. The figure stood behind him, watching the monitor screen with disturbing calm. Samuel stood paralyzed, feeling the cold of reality tighten his bones. He looked back, but there was nothing but the cold wall and the computer. His breathing quickened, and he felt as if the air had become thick, dense, as if something was watching him, waiting. He blinked. The figure disappeared, but the fear he was unable to dispel. The sound of the monitor echoed in the surveillance room, cutting through the silence that dominated the abandoned building. The system's metallic beep was enough to make Samuel move away from his chair and turn his eyes to the screens. He noticed the notification flashing in one corner of the screen. Motion detected. East wing. Corridor disabled. He frowned. That part of the building had been closed for months, completely isolated from the rest of the building. No one had access. There was no power there, and the sensors weren't working. It was a dead sector. And yet, the camera system had detected movement. Samuel blinked a few times, unsure if his eyes were playing a trick on him. He pressed the controls and zoomed in, the screen going blurry for a moment, before focusing on the dark, empty hallway that stretched into the disabled wing. Details were difficult to discern from a distance, but soon he saw what appeared to be a dark figure, moving slowly down the hallway as the image gained clarity. The figure was walking with a disturbing calm. No rush, no nervousness. She didn't seem to worry about the possibility of being seen, which added to the strangeness of the situation. Samuel felt a wave of discomfort rise within him. Someone was in that hallway. Someone who shouldn't have been there. But how was this possible? The camera system was turned off in that wing, and the access door had been locked since the last closure. There was no way anyone could have gotten in there without being noticed. The figure on the monitor seemed as still as its surroundings. He didn't hide in the shadows. He didn't rush in search of some refuge. She just walked, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence of the building. The camera's dim light illuminated the figure intermittently, and Samuel had the impression that she knew she was being watched, as if the presence of the camera, and consequently yours, was not a reason for apprehension. The feeling was that I was being directly confronted, but in a silent, almost calculated way. Samuel squinted his eyes to try to make out more details. The figure was indistinct, its outline blurred by shadows. He tried to find some movement, some clue that would explain what was happening, but all he saw was the calm walk of that being through the desolate corridor. A chill ran down his spine, and he felt his chest tighten. All of that was wrong. For a moment, he thought about leaving the room, going to the deactivated wing and seeing for himself what was happening. But fear made him hesitate. Something in his instinct told him not to move, to stand there and watch, as if simply approaching that figure was wrong, a violation of something beyond his understanding. He enlarged the image even further, trying to find some more specific detail that could clarify what was happening. The figure seemed more distant now, but the slow steps continued to mark the rhythm of that strange movement. The empty, dark corridor offered no explanations. Everything seemed in perfect harmony, except for the presence of something that shouldn't be there. Samuel's heart quickened. That feeling of restlessness took over his body, as if the entire building was turning against him. And then, the movement of the figure on the monitor stopped. The figure was completely still, standing in the center of the hallway, as if it was waiting, as if it knew Samuel was there watching. He couldn't help but feel that there was something more behind that apparition, something else that he didn't understand, but that at the same time, he knew he shouldn't ignore. Samuel's breathing became heavy, the air in the room becoming thicker, as if tension was materializing around him. He forced himself to look away from the screen, but his mind was fixed on the image. Something was wrong, something he couldn't understand, but knew, with growing certainty, that he should investigate. But before he could act, the monitor flickered again, and the screen changed. The image of the deactivated wing disappeared, and the sound from the camera system went silent again, as if nothing had happened. Samuel found himself alone again in the surveillance room, the absolute silence becoming even heavier. The only thing that remained was the feeling that something was watching him, that something was still behind that screen, and he didn't know if he wanted to find out what it was. Samuel was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the monitor screen, as fear began to spread throughout his body. The figure in the disabled corridor, which had previously walked with disturbing tranquility, now seemed to have disappeared. He didn't know what was happening, but a growing feeling that something was about to happen forced him to act. With a shaking hand, he picked up the communication radio and pressed the button, trying to contact the building's caretaker. "This is the security guard. Can you hear me?" he said, his voice tense. There was no answer, just the empty static sound that filled the radio. He repeated the call, but again, silence was the only response. Something was wrong. The caretaker should be at his post, always available for any emergency. But now, he was incommunicado. Samuel looked again at the access controls on the wall beside him. The screen showed the entrance and exit of the building, but they were all recording as if nothing had happened. No movement was recorded, no keys were used, no access was allowed. It was as if the building was closed to the outside world, as if everything there was an abandoned, unchanging scene. But he knew that wasn't the case. Discomfort turned into impatience. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening. He couldn't just ignore what he saw on camera, not after feeling that presence in the hallway, something so out of place. Samuel got up from his chair with a heavy sigh, picked up the flashlight that was on the table, and turned it on, feeling the dim light illuminate his tense face. He walked toward the surveillance room door, his flashlight illuminating the dark, empty hallways of the building. The silence that surrounded him was absolute, almost oppressive. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the environment itself was trying to slow down his movement. The sound of his feet echoed off the concrete walls, but he didn't dare make too much noise. Something told him that any distraction could worsen whatever was happening. When crossing the disused corridors, the walls stained with dirt and the smell of damp mixed with mold took over the environment. The lamps, for the most part, were off, and the only light came from the flashlight in his hands. Each ray of light illuminated a part of the path, but also created distorted shadows in the corners, shadows that seemed to move with the light, further increasing the discomfort. The place was in complete abandonment. There were no signs of life, nor any movement. The feeling of loneliness and desolation was palpable. Samuel felt like he was walking through a nightmare, where time had stopped and nothing made sense anymore. He forced his mind to focus, to not give in to the growing pressure that tried to crush him. He needed to get to the east wing, to the point where the figure had been seen. When he reached the point indicated by the camera, he stopped for a moment and looked around. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. No sound. No presence. Just dust, scattered across the floor, as if nothing had moved there for a long time. Samuel took a few steps forward, pointing the flashlight in every corner. Shadows danced on the walls as he illuminated the room, but nothing moved. Nothing was out of place, but something inside him insisted that he was being watched, as if every piece of the place was trying to tell him something he didn't yet understand. He got closer, examining the place more carefully. Nothing. The silence was absolute, almost deafening. He crouched down, touching the dust-covered floor, trying to feel something different. But all he found was the faint touch of accumulated dirt, as if time had stopped there and the place had been forgotten. By everyone. That doesn't make sense, Samuel thought, standing up and turning to look around once more. But before he could take a step, the feeling that something was wrong intensified. He looked once more into the dark hallways, listening for any sound that broke the silence. But there was nothing. He was alone. The cold on the back of his neck intensified. Something was very wrong, and he could no longer ignore it. Something, or someone, was there. Something he still couldn't see, and suddenly, he was sure that the worst was yet to come. Samuel returned to the monitoring room, his heart racing, his thoughts confused. His body was tense, as if with every movement he was being watched, as if the building itself was turning against him. The silence of the deactivated wing still echoed in his mind, becoming a crushing weight. He could not understand what he had seen, or rather, what he had not seen. Something was wrong, and he couldn't put it into words. His instinct told him to stay alert, but he wasn't sure what to look for. He sat down again in front of the monitors and began reviewing the recordings, trying to understand what had happened. He quickly advanced the images, moving from one screen to another, hoping to find some logical explanation, something that made sense. His gaze was fixed on the screen, but his mind kept wandering. What was that? Who was there? Why did he feel like he was being followed? That's when he arrived at the recording from the room's own internal camera. He already knew what would happen next, but he couldn't stop his hands from moving. He clicked forward, still hoping it was just a system error, a play of lights, or a technical problem. But what appeared on the screen made his breath hitch for a moment. There he was, on the recording, sitting in the chair, with his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. His body was in a relaxed posture, still focused on the images, while the light from the screen reflected on his face. But what made him stop was the figure behind him, the dark silhouette, motionless, observing him. It was so close, but it was still not possible to make out any details. There was no face, no expressions, just the dense darkness that took the human form. The figure was standing there so close that at any moment he could reach out and touch him, but he did nothing. It was just there, as if waiting. Samuel swallowed and paused the recording. His heart raced. Fear settled in his throat, making every breath an effort. He looked at the screen, his eyes scanning the frozen image. There was no doubt. The presence was there, in the recording, and he clearly remembered being alone in the room, with no one by his side. But now, he saw something, someone, there behind him. A shadow with human form but without identity. And the most terrifying thing was that the figure seemed to be watching him. I knew he was there. I knew he was watching. He turned his head quickly, looked over his shoulder, eyes trying to catch any movement, any sign that someone might be there. But the room was empty. The only sound was your own labored breathing, the pulse of your heart still beating loudly in your chest. There was nothing there. The room was as it should be, quiet, empty, with no signs of life, just silence. No, it can't be, he muttered to himself, looking back at the screen. The figure was still there, frozen, undisturbed. He squinted his eyes, trying to rationalize what was happening. It couldn't be real. He was seeing things. It was a system error, perhaps a reflection, a distortion of the light. But the dread in his stomach said otherwise. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He stood up quickly, the chair creaking with the sudden movement, and walked to the window, trying to escape the weight of the room, the weight of the vision he had just seen. But when he looked outside, all he saw was darkness. The building was deserted, lifeless. The building, which had once seemed so safe, now seemed ominous, as if something was watching it from all directions. He looked at the monitor screen again. The figure was there. There was no denying it. It was so close, so real. Samuel felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and for the first time, the feeling of being completely vulnerable came over him. He tried to convince himself that it was just a mistake, a trick of the mind, but the figure behind him seemed very real. He knew that what he was seeing couldn't just be an illusion. Breathing still labored, he paused the recording and looked at the empty room once more. His eyes roamed the cold walls, the stagnant air. Nothing moved. The figure behind him had disappeared from the screen, but the feeling that something was there somewhere watching him wouldn't go away. Every corner of the room seemed to carry an invisible presence, something he couldn't understand but knew he shouldn't ignore. He looked at the screen one last time, trying to convince himself that it was just a glitch in the system, that his mind was creating monsters where there were none. But deep down, he knew something more was at play, and he was no longer alone. Samuel sat in front of the monitors again, his eyes fixed on the frozen screen, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure, that dark figure, was there, motionless, watching him as he focused on the screen. He felt his heart still racing, but now a more disturbing sensation was beginning to take over him. It wasn't just the proximity of the figure. It was the growing feeling that he had already seen it somewhere. There was something familiar about the figure, something he couldn't identify. He felt a shiver run down his spine as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a disjointed manner. With a sigh of exasperation, Samuel decided to review the video frame by frame. He clicked the arrows on the keyboard, slowly advancing through the images. Each frame showed the figure in different positions, the dark shadow becoming clearer by the second. But nothing changed the fact that she was there, behind him, in the space he knew was empty. He advanced a little further, eyes fixed on the screen until something caught his attention. At a certain point, the figure made a movement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Samuel noticed it clearly. The figure tilted its head, as if observing the screen curiously. The feeling of discomfort increased. The figure no longer looked like just any shadow. He was reacting to what Samuel was doing, as if he understood his actions. Strangest of all, however, was the way he tilted his head, a gesture that wasn't mechanical but seemed full of intention. The figure seemed to understand what was happening, as if it was trying to decipher the image on the screen, as if it recognized the situation. Or worse, as if he recognized it. The figure's face, although still dark and indistinct, seemed to carry a trace of familiarity. Samuel frowned, his eyes trying to focus on the details, looking for something that could give him an answer. But the face, though dark, looked vaguely familiar. The image seemed like a distorted reflection of something he should know, something he couldn't remember, something that was in the depths of his memory, but he couldn't reach. Like a fragmented nightmare that you know you lived, but can't reconstruct. He stood up, agitated, and looked at his surroundings, trying to shake off the feeling that the monitor was reflecting something more than just a recording. But when he looked back at the screen, the strangeness hit him hard again. He couldn't ignore what he was seeing. The figure seemed more and more real, and the idea that she was watching him with a certain recognition made his stomach turn. Driven by a growing need to get rid of that vision, Samuel decided to delete the recording. He pressed the buttons on the keyboard, his hand shaking slightly as he tried to deselect the file, forcing the system to delete it. But what happened next made his heart skip a beat. The system crashed. The keys didn't respond. He pressed the keys again, harder, and nothing happened. The monitor blinked once, then another, and suddenly the screen went dark. Samuel looked on, perplexed, as the recording image faded, leaving only darkness on the screen. He tried everything to restart the system, pressing buttons and messing with settings, but the monitor was unresponsive. Then, in a move he couldn't control, the monitor restarted itself. The home screen logo appeared as if it were doing a normal boot, but something was wrong. It wasn't just the computer. It was the air around him, as if the environment itself was adjusting, changing imperceptibly. He looked at the now clean monitor, and what he saw made him freeze in place. The screen no longer displayed the recording he had just reviewed. There were no more security camera videos. There was no longer the figure in the recording. Instead, the screen showed something else, an image of Samuel sitting in front of the screen at the exact moment he was watching the recording. And behind him, standing in the shadow, was the figure. The figure was there again, and this time, there was no doubt. It was the same silhouette, the same presence, so close, so real. No face, just a dark shadow, undisturbed, as if waiting, as if preparing for something. And Samuel felt with a terrifying intensity that she was no longer just watching. Now, she was waiting for him. The screen flickered again, the glow of the system restart bringing brief relief as if time were moving again. Samuel took a deep breath, but his stomach felt heavy, a feeling of rising panic that he couldn't shake. The screen started to light up one by one, but something was wrong. The images from the cameras that previously showed the corridors and empty rooms were now all black. The emptiness of the screen reflected the emptiness he felt in his chest. The only exception was one. The camera in the deactivated hallway, the same one that had captured the figure earlier, was alive. Samuel stared at the screen, eyes wide, trying to process what he saw. The figure was there, standing in the same place he had seen it before. But now, there was something different. She was facing directly into the camera lens, as if looking at him, as if she knew he was watching. The gesture, so simple but so full of meaning, made his heart stop for a moment. It was no longer just a shadow at the end of a dark hallway. Now, it seemed like she was aware of him, aware that he saw her. He stood still. The air felt thick around him. He swallowed hard, but he couldn't look away from the screen. The figure, still indistinct, watched him. Samuel felt an icy sensation run down his spine, as if something was crawling under his skin. The room around him seemed to have become colder, quieter, as if space itself was compressing. The screen flashed once again, this time more intensely, and then the figure moved. Samuel couldn't believe what he saw. He watched, unable to move as the figure began to approach the camera. First, it was a considerable distance away, but now, with each flash of the screen, the silhouette grew closer. Their eyes couldn't process the scene properly, as if reality was distorting before them. In the blink of an eye, the figure was so close to the camera that Samuel felt as if he was looking directly at him, not just on the screen, but in his mind. The details of the figure, previously unclear and shadowy, began to become clearer. But still, there was no face, no identity. Just darkness, emptiness, and the growing sensation that this being was not a simple apparition. He was conscious, and more than that, he was interacting with Samuel. Suddenly, the screen flashed once more and, with a low, strange sound, the figure disappeared from the camera. But he was no longer in the hallway. It was no longer on the screen. One moment, he was there, the next he was gone. Samuel looked around, feeling his body stiffen. He got up from his chair in a hurry, looking around the room, as if he was trying to find an explanation for what he was seeing. He touched the screen with his hand, still in disbelief at what had just happened. The figure was no longer in the hallway. But the feeling that something was present, something that shouldn't be there, was palpable. The cold in the room suddenly increased, as if the air around him was becoming thicker, colder. Samuel felt his fingers grow cold as he moved away from the table, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort that was overwhelming him. He looked out the window, hoping to see some light, something familiar that would give him reassurance. But the windows were darkened by the night, and the dim light from the monitors did nothing to dispel the feeling of oppression. What was happening? He looked at the monitor again, still in shock. The camera in the deactivated hallway was now empty. But the feeling that the figure was somewhere watching him didn't leave him. The room had grown cold, and each breath felt harder to take. He didn't know if he was delusional, or if he was experiencing something that went beyond what reason could explain. Dread began to take over him. He could no longer trust what he saw. The walls seemed to close in, and the sound of the air conditioning, once monotonous, now seemed like a scream, a reminder that he was no longer alone in that room. The monitor was off, but the feeling of being watched, that the presence was still there, seemed to intensify. The cold didn't let up, and Samuel felt that something much more sinister was unfolding before his eyes. The figure was no longer in the hallway. He was here. He was inside the room, inside his mind. And Samuel knew with frightening clarity that there was no going back. He was no longer in control. Samuel was sweating. The air in the room felt thick, heavier than ever. His eyes were fixed on the monitors, but his body was on high alert, as if something was about to happen. The lights in the monitoring room began to flicker, a faint light that flickered on and off with an erratic rhythm, as if the energy was being stirred by an invisible force. The sound of the fan that previously filled the room was interrupted by a hiss, as if something was interfering with the normal flow of the space around Samuel. But the worst was to come. A noise behind him, a deep creak, cut through the silence of the room. It was the chair. Samuel felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the sound intensified. It felt like something was pushing the chair, moving it slowly, as if an invisible weight was there, testing the limits of the room. The sound was growing, disturbing, as if a presence was physically manifesting in their proximity. Samuel could no longer control his breathing. The fear was so real, so palpable, that his chest felt tight, as if the air itself was refusing to enter his lungs. He turned around immediately, the flashlight in his hand shaking as it illuminated the room with a dim light, trying to find what was causing the noise. But when the flashlight's light swept across the space, he saw nothing. There was nothing there. Just the chair, motionless as it should be, the cold and lifeless environment. His gaze quickly swept around the room, every corner, but nothing made him feel safer. Panic began to rise in his chest, and he was sure he was being tricked. That, his mind was playing tricks on him. But what he felt, what he heard, was real. He turned his eyes to the monitor again. The screen flashed once more, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The figure was there, but now no longer in the deactivated hallway. She was in the surveillance room itself, standing behind him, exactly where he was a few moments before. The dark, faceless silhouette was there towards him, so close that he could almost feel her presence like a heavy shadow on his shoulders. It was as if she had walked through the screen, as if she were there, physically, at his fingertips. Fear gripped Samuel, and he stood up quickly, the flashlight in his hand shaking uncontrollably. He turned around again, trying to find any sign that this was just an illusion, but the room was empty, as if everything was perfectly in place. He looked back at the monitoring room door, and that was when shock took over his body. The door was closed. He was sure the door was open when he entered. Now it was locked. There was no one there, but the fear that something was about to happen kept him paralyzed for a moment. The silence that had taken over the room was suddenly broken by the sound of the radio. A hiss, as if the system was about to fail, and then a low, slurred voice, whispered, clearly audible through the noise of static. "Keep looking." Those words cut through the air with terrifying intensity. Samuel felt his throat tighten. The radio was transmitting that message directly to him. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed, dread locking his muscles. He glanced at the door, the feeling of being watched now intensifying. The flashlight in his hand shook, and the light flickered faster and faster. He wanted to run, he wanted to escape, but his body didn't respond. All he could do was look straight ahead, at that screen, at that figure that now seemed to be everywhere. What he saw on the screen was no longer the still figure. She was moving, but not in the hallway. She was in the room with him. Each movement of the silhouette brought him closer to his chair, closer to where he was, as if it had been attracted by his presence, as if it had been waiting for this moment to act. The shadows of the room stretched around Samuel, making the light from the flashlight dimmer and dimmer, as if the room itself was closing in on him. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to think anymore. The tension reached its peak. The light from the flashlight failed once and for all, and Samuel found himself immersed in darkness. The only thing that remained was the sound of her breathing, labored and desperate, and the whisper of the radio. He still didn't know what was happening, but he knew with a terrifying certainty that he was no longer alone. Something was with him, there, in the room, and he was arrested. Samuel was immersed in darkness, the flashlight failing, and his rapid breathing filling the emptiness of the room. The cold was increasing, and the dread that had gripped his body now seemed to be taking deep root in his mind. The feeling that something, or someone, was there, watching him, had never been so strong. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know if his life was at risk or if everything was just a hallucination caused by the terror that had taken over him. Suddenly, without any warning, the system returned to normal. The monitor turned on again, the light from the screen shining into his eyes. But something wasn't right. Samuel blinked, eyes still adjusting to the light, and then the image on the screen made him freeze in place. It was him, himself, sitting in front of the screen, his eyes fixed on the monitor, completely immersed in what he was seeing. But what really made him feel the weight of a terrible truth was the reflection that appeared in the glass of the screen. In that reflection, there was not just Samuel. There were two bodies. One was his, of course, but the other was behind him. The figure he had seen in so many recordings, was there, standing right behind him, so close that the shadow blended with his own image. Samuel couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if the figure had been with him the entire time, invisible to his eyes but reflected on the screen. As if she were inside her own image, watching, waiting. Fear reached a new peak. He stood up abruptly, his chair rocking with the movement, and tried to turn away from the screen. His eyes were fixed on that image, but now his body demanded action. He needed to leave. He needed to escape. Panic pushed him towards the doors of the room, his sweaty hands trying to unlock any of them, but they were all locked. The door handles didn't budge. Terror gripped him once again, the tightness in his chest becoming almost unbearable. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. It was then that he realized something even more terrifying. The other cameras started showing the same image. He, sitting in front of the screen, completely immersed in what he saw. But on every camera, the shadow was there, behind him, in every room, in every hallway, as if he were being followed at every point in the building, as if the figure was in every room at once, a ghostly presence that moved through every lens, an immortal shadow that seemed to be extending in every direction. Panic took over Samuel in an overwhelming way. He looked again at the monitor in the surveillance room, and the reflection was there, clearer than ever. The figure was so close to his body, as if it was beginning to take its shape, as if the darkness was merging with his own identity. He tried to move away, tried to leave, but the doors were still locked. The monitor blinked once more, as if mocking him, and the figure behind Samuel moved a step forward, now practically glued to him. It was as if what he was seeing on the screen was happening now, as if everything was connected, as if he was already lost forever. The room seemed to shrink around Samuel, the air becoming increasingly dense. He didn't know if he was experiencing a hallucination, or if it was all real. The feeling of being watched, of being completely at the mercy of something beyond human understanding, crushed him. And yet, the figure did nothing. He was simply there, in every image, in every reflection, observing, waiting. Samuel felt his breath hitch, and for the first time, he realized the truth, a truth he didn't want to accept. He was trapped, not just in the surveillance room, but inside something much bigger. The presence behind him, the shadow that moved across the cameras, was not just a being from physical space. It was something that consumed him, that took over him on such a deep level that he could no longer distinguish where it ended and where the presence began. He looked one last time at the reflection on the screen. It was too late. The figure was there, behind him, and he could no longer hide. The next morning, the cleaning crew arrived early as usual. They didn't know what awaited them in that surveillance room, but they were used to the routine, to the deep silence that always filled the empty space of the building. The door was unlocked as if nothing strange had happened, but when they entered, they soon realized that something was out of place. The coffee was spilled on the table, the cup was broken, and the flashlight was thrown on the floor, next to the chair where Samuel usually sat. The team members looked at each other, somewhat perplexed. They knew that Samuel was on shift until late in the morning, but no one had seen him leave, and now the room seemed strangely disordered. The computer was on, the screen glowing faintly, but no one was there to look at the monitors. The usual sound of the machine and the hum of the ventilation seemed more intense than ever, as if the room was waiting for something. One of the employees, more curious, approached the monitoring station and began reviewing the system's images, which they did every morning to check the security of the building. But when they accessed the most recent video, it froze. The video was labeled "Last Shift, 1:04 a.m., the exact time Samuel should have left. However, what appeared on the screen made no sense. The video showed Samuel's chair slowly turning on its own, as if it had been pushed by an invisible force. The camera captured the movement of the chair, its silent rotation in the emptiness of the room. There was no one in the chair, no one sitting, but it turned with precision, as if someone was steering it without physical touch. The scene was empty, but the chair seemed to come to life, defying any logical explanation. The silence in the room, which had previously been comforting, now seemed more oppressive, as if the room itself was breathing. The employees watched, mesmerized by the screen, when suddenly something else manifested itself. The camera captured movement, a subtle detail that made everyone's blood in the room freeze. A dark hand, as vague as the shadow itself, appeared in the recording. Slowly, reaching out to rest on the shoulder of someone who was clearly not there. The hand had no defined shape, as if it were part of the darkness, an extension of the shadow itself, but it was impossible to ignore. She moved with terrifying calm, touching nothingness, as if she were trying to make contact with something invisible, something that should have been there but had disappeared. The team members fell silent, the weight of what they were seeing becoming almost unbearable. None of us knew what happened after that recording. They knew that something inexplicable had occurred, but no one dared to say anything. The air in the room seemed even thicker, as if time itself had stopped to watch the scene. The video ended abruptly without any further movement. The chair stopped spinning, and the monitor remained frozen on the last image, the room empty, but still carrying the feeling of something terribly wrong. There were no more signs of Samuel. He wasn't there, neither in the images nor in the room. The cleaning team remained silent, each one reflecting, not knowing how to act. The doors were closed, the monitoring system intact. But Samuel? Samuel was no longer there. What had happened that night? They couldn't say for sure, but one thing was clear. The building and everything within it now seemed to be charged with a presence that no one could see, but everyone felt. Samuel's name never appeared on the shift schedules again, and the surveillance room remained empty, as if waiting for the next person to fall into the same trap, the same illusion of security that had been given to him. The video was archived, and no one else dared to review the material. But whenever someone passed by the surveillance room, the feeling of being watched was almost palpable, as if the shadow that was there, behind Samuel, was still waiting to play the next person who dared to sit in that chair, looking at the screen, believing that everything was under control, and deep down everyone knew nothing would ever be the same.